Right, hi guys, and welcome to the next part of my bookshelf tour. I'm going to carry on doing the fiction today, so I'll pick up where I left off last time, and I've just been having a little look over the bookshelves, and there's a couple of really big fantasy series on this part, and also some fantastic historical fiction as well, particularly if you like the Vikings. Right then, so onto the next shelf, and first up, like shelf decoration, we've got a combination square set with a centre finder and a protractor that my brother got me for Christmas, which is good of him. And then the first of the books, we've got The Third World War by General Sir John Hackett and others, which is like a speculative fiction written, I think it was written in the 80s. And then we've got some fantasy by David Hare that I've not read yet, The Mage's Blood, the first book in the Moontide Quartet. Next up, we've got some Anglo-Saxon based historical fiction, the first book in the Bernicia Chronicles, The Serpent Sword by Matthew Harvey. This is the first book in, I don't know, I think there's quite a few in the series anyway, and it's the only one I've read, but I really enjoyed it, so I'm definitely going to get the rest of them at some point. Then we've got a bit of alternate history from Robert Harris, Fatherland. Also by Robert Harris, we've got a spy thriller, Archangel, and some historical fiction about Julius Caesar, Dictator. Then a bit of classic science fiction by Robert A. Heinlein, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. We've got the first book in the really excellent Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, Assassin's Apprentice, and I've done reviews of all three books in this trilogy, so check them out if you're interested. And the second book in that trilogy, Royal Assassin, and the third one, Assassin's Quest. And then the next trilogy that she wrote in the same world, I've not actually started reading this yet, but it's the Live Ship Traders trilogy, and the first book is Ship of Magic. Then you got The Mad Ship, and the final Robin Hobb book that I own, Ship of Destiny. Now, I'm sure you'll see as we go through this bookshelf tour that I quite like the Legends of King Arthur, and this next trilogy is one of the best retellings of that I think I've read, and that is the Pendragon's Banner trilogy by Helen Hollick, and this is the first book, The King Making, and the second one, Pendragon's Banner, and lastly, Shadow of the King. Then we got another trilogy about King Arthur, this time by M.K. Hume. First up, Dragon's Child, then Warrior of the West, and finally The Bloody Cup. And that brings us on to the last writer that I've got on this shelf, but he does stretch on to the next one because I've got quite a few of his books. He's a really excellent historical fiction writer, and this is his Emperor series, which is about the rise of Julius Caesar and the beginnings of the Roman Empire. It's by Connie Golden, and this is the first book, The Gates of Rome. Then you've got The Death of Kings, The Field of Swords, and The Gods of War. Right, and that brings us on to the next shelf, which I have ornamented with a really nice set square, and also a folding rule that my uncle gave me. So continuing with the Connie Golden books, we've got a standalone novel set in 10th century England, Dunstan. And then the first book in what I think is his best series, and it chronicles like the life of Genghis Khan and his successors. This is the first book, Wolf of the Plains. And then we've got Lords of the Bow, Bones of the Hills, Empire of Silver, and finally Conqueror. And then we've got his 4-book series about the War of the Roses. First up, Stormbird, then Trinity, Bloodline, and finally Ravenspur, and they all have like really nice covers. And then writing under C.F. Igolden is the first book in his fantasy series called Darien Empire of Salt, which I've not got round to reading yet, but I intend to pretty soon. Then I've got 3 books by Glyn Illith about Odysseus. First up, King of Ithaca, then The Gates of Troy, and finally The Armour of Achilles. Got The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro, set in Dark Age Britain. And as you can see from the bookmark, this is what I'm reading at the moment. It's Templars Acra by Michael Jex. and it's about the 12th century siege of Accra. So yeah, once I finish that, I will put up a review of it. And next up, we've got all of the Wheel of Time books by Robert Jordan. This is a huge epic fantasy series. This is the first book. It's a prequel. I've done a review of this that you can check out if you want. It's called New Spring. This is book 1 of the main series, The Eye of the World, The Great Hunt, The Dragon Reborn, The Shadow Rising, The Fires of Heaven, Lord of Chaos, A Crown of Swords, The Path of Daggers, Winter's Heart, Crossroads of Twilight, Knife of Dreams, The Gathering Storm, which was co-written by Brandon Sanderson, as are the next 2 books in the series. Towers of Midnight, and finally, both for the series and for the shelf, we've got A Memory of Light. Okay, so first up on this shelf we've got 2 of the mallets that I use for my wood carving. Then we've got the first of 6 or 7 books by Ben Kane, which are all based during the Roman period. First up we've got Hannibal, Enemy of Rome, then Hannibal, Fields of Blood, Hannibal, Clouds of War, Spartacus the Gladiator, The Forgotten Legion, The Silver Eagle, and Hunting the Eagles. Then we've got a couple of Stephen King books. We've got the first book in the Dark Tower series, The Gunslinger, and then his psychological thriller, Misery. Next up we've got some fantasy based in the Warhammer universe. It is the second Gotrek and Felix omnibus that contains Dragon Slayer, Beast Slayer and Vampire Slayer. Then we've got some Dragon Realm, Fire Drake by Richard A. Knark, Frankenstein Lost Souls by Dean Koontz, and then we've got 2 really good trilogies by Giles Christian that are based around the Vikings. First up we've got Raven Blood Eye, then Sons of Thunder, and finishing off the Raven trilogy we've got Odin's Wolves. And then there's an equally good prequel trilogy to that. It is the Rise of Sigurd trilogy, and it starts off with Winter's Fire. I think these are in the right order. Then Wings of the Storm, and finally God of Vengeance. And he's also done a standalone novel, Lancelot. And then we've got a Viking period historical fantasy trilogy by Snorri Christiansen, starting off with Swords of Good Men. And the second book is Blood Will Follow, and finishing up with Path of Gods. Then we've got Stephen Lawhead's 5-book Pendragon cycle about the legends of King Arthur. Firstly, Taliesin, then Merlin, Arthur, Pendragon, and Grail. And then there's a sequel to that series called Avalon. And then another trilogy that he's done about the legends of Robin Hood. First up, Hood, then Scarlet, and finally Tuck. Then we've got Ross Leckey's trilogy about the Second Punic Wars. First up, Hannibal, then Scipio, and last up we've got Carthage. Got an omnibus edition of Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy, and The Telling, also by Ursula Le Guin. And then we've got some more really good Viking historical fiction. It's the 5-book Oathsworn series by Robert Lowe, starting off with The Whale Road, followed by The Wolf Sea, The White Raven, The Prow Beast, and Crowbone. And then his trilogy about the Scottish Wars of Independence. First up we've got The Lion Wakes, then The Lion at Bay, finishing up with The Lion Rampant. And that takes us on to the next shelf. First up on this I've got like a nice old sliding bevel, and that is actually my grandpa's old hammer. Right, so first up bookwise on this shelf we've got Jack Ludlow's trilogy about Norman Italy, starting off with Mercenaries, then Warriors, and finally Conquest. Then we've got Scott Lynch's excellent crime fantasy, the first book in the Gentleman Bastard sequence, that is The Lies of Loch Lamora. And the second book, which I've not got round to reading yet, I've only just bought it, but that is Red Seas Under Red Skies. And then we've got a historical mystery that my brother got me. I think it's set in 15th century Ireland if I remember rightly. That is A Game of Sorrows by Shona MacLean. We've got 2 Hilary Mantel novels about the Tudors. First up, Wolf Hall, and then Bring Up the Bodies. Then A Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin. I'm sure you all know this one already, but it starts off with A Game of Thrones. Then you've got A Clash of Kings, A Storm of Swords Part 1, Steel and Snow, and Part 2, Blood and Gold. A Feast for Crows, A Dance with Dragons Part 1, Dreams and Dust, and Part 2, After the Feast. And they're all from a box set that my brother got me for Christmas, so yeah, much appreciated. Then we've got some science fiction and science fantasy from Anne McCaffrey. First up, The Crystal Singer, Decision at Duna, and then a few books from her Dragon Riders of Pern series, The White Dragon, Dragon Flight, Dragon Singer, Harper of Pern, and finally Dragon Drums. Then we've got the first book from one of my favourite series about King Arthur. This is the Albion series by Patrick McCormack. I've actually done reviews of both of these 2 books, so you can check them out if you want. Firstly, we've got The Last Companion, and then The White Phantom. There was actually a 3rd book to this series released called The Lame Dancer, I think, and you can download that for free from the author's website. It wasn't published, I don't know why, it's a great book. Then we got some Roman historical fiction from Colleen McCulloch, The First Man in Rome. Then we've got some science fiction set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, both by Graham McNeil. First up, False Gods, then Fulgrim, then The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. Then we've got a fantasy trilogy, or actually it might be a tetralogy, but I've only got the first 3. I don't really know anything about it, haven't read it yet, but that is first up, The Horse Lord by Peter Morwood, then The Demon Lord, and finally The Dragon Lord. Then we've got William Napier's brilliant trilogy about Attila the Hun. Excellent historical fiction this. First up, Attila, then The Gathering of the Storm, and finally The Judgment. And then a couple of his books about the Crusades. We've got Clash of Empires, The Great Siege, and The Last Crusaders, Ivan the Terrible. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that, and I will carry on with the bookshelf tour another time when I've got time to do some more editing. There's still some really great books left in the fiction bit, so I'll see you next time for that.